When I suggested inviting my ex-boyfriend to join my husband and me for dinner, I thought I was making a harmless joke about spicing up our marriage. Instead, I watched David's face drain of all colour as those words hung in the air between us like a final verdict for our 4-year marriage. We were sitting in Romano's, the upscale Italian restaurant downtown, where David had taken me to celebrate my recent promotion to marketing director. The candlelit table, expensive wine, and David's genuine pride in my achievement had created the perfect romantic atmosphere. I should have been completely focused on my husband and our celebration, but instead, I found myself thinking about Ted. David had been talking about how we'd grown distant lately, how he wanted us to reconnect and try new things together. He'd used the phrase spice things up, with that earnest expression he got when he was trying to be spontaneous, and something about his word choice triggered a memory of Ted using those exact words years ago, but with a completely different energy behind it. The suggestion had slipped out before I could stop myself, accompanied by what I thought was an obviously playful laugh. Maybe we should invite Ted to join us sometime. I'd expected David to chuckle, maybe make a joke back about my college boyfriend, but instead he went completely silent. His wine glass stopped halfway to his mouth, and he stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Part confusion, part hurt, part something that looked almost like fear. David carefully set down his glass and asked me to repeat what I'd just said, his voice quiet and controlled in a way that made my stomach drop. When I tried to laugh it off, telling him it was obviously just a joke, he didn't smile back. Instead, he signaled for the check without touching another bite of his osso buco, paid with cash instead of his usual careful credit card calculation, and walked to the car in complete silence. The 20-minute drive home felt like hours. David kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, while I alternated between trying to explain that it had been a silly comment and getting defensive about his overreaction. By the time we pulled into our driveway in the suburban neighbourhood we'd chosen together 3 years ago, I was angry at David for ruining what should have been a celebration of my career success. My name is Sarah, and at 29 I thought I had figured out how to balance my desire for excitement with the stability that David represented. I'd worked hard to build my career in marketing, climbing from an entry-level position to director in just 5 years, and I'd been equally deliberate about building a solid marriage with a man who shared my values and life goals. David was 32, a financial advisor with a methodical approach to everything from retirement planning to choosing restaurants. Where I was impulsive and creative, he was thoughtful and systematic. Where I craved novelty and adventure, he found comfort in routines and traditions. We'd met at a mutual friend's birthday party 4.5 years ago, and I'd been immediately drawn to his stability after a series of relationships with men who were exciting but unreliable. Our wedding had been small and elegant, exactly the kind of celebration that reflected our practical approach to building a life together. We'd bought our 3-bedroom colonial in Westchester with a sensible mortgage and a 5-year plan for improvements. David had been promoted twice since we'd married, and with my recent advancement, we were finally reaching the financial security we'd both worked toward. But somewhere in the past year, that security had started to feel less like an achievement and more like a trap. Our conversations had become predictable discussions about work, weekend plans, and household maintenance. David would come home every evening at exactly 6:15, change into his comfortable clothes, and settle into his recliner with a beer while I finished preparing dinner. We'd eat together while watching the news, clean up the kitchen in our established routine, and spend the evening on separate devices in the same room. It wasn't that I was unhappy with David, exactly. He was still the kind, thoughtful man I'd married, still someone who remembered anniversaries and brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings. But I'd started to feel like we were more like efficient roommates than passionate partners, going through the motions of married life without the spark that had brought us together. That's when Ted had re-entered my life 6 months ago, appearing as suddenly as he'd disappeared 4 years earlier. He'd moved back to town for a job opportunity and had reached out through social media, suggesting we meet for coffee as old friends. I'd told David about the message, and he'd encouraged me to reconnect, secure enough in our marriage to not feel threatened by my past relationships. Ted looked exactly as I remembered. tall and lean with those dark eyes that had always made me feel like he was seeing something in me that no one else could. But there was a maturity to him now, a professional polish that came from years of working in international consulting. He talked about his travels, the places he'd seen and people he'd met, making my suburban life feel small and confined by comparison. During that first coffee meeting, Ted had been careful to keep things friendly and appropriate, asking about my career and my marriage with what seemed like genuine interest. But there had been moments when his attention felt too intense, when his questions about my happiness seemed to probe deeper than casual friendship required. We'd ended up meeting for coffee a second time 2 weeks later, and that's when the conversation had shifted into more dangerous territory. Ted had been more direct about his own life, admitting that his years of travelling and freedom had left him feeling isolated and wondering what he'd missed by avoiding commitment. He'd asked pointed questions about whether I ever felt like I'd settled down too quickly, whether I ever wondered about the path not taken. I'd found myself being more honest than I should have been, admitting that married life sometimes felt routine, that I occasionally missed the excitement and unpredictability of my younger years. Ted had listened with that focused attention I remembered, making me feel heard and understood in a way that David's well-meaning but distracted responses never quite achieved. During our second meeting, there had been a moment when Ted had reached across the table to touch my hand while making a point about how much he'd missed our connection. The contact had lasted only seconds, but it had sent a jolt of electricity through me that I hadn't felt in years. When he'd suggested we should meet again soon, I'd agreed without thinking about the implications. The third meeting had happened just a week before my dinner with David at Romano's. Ted had been more flirtatious, more direct about his regrets over our breakup, and his curiosity about whether I was truly happy in my marriage. As we'd walked to our cars after coffee, he'd stopped and turned to face me, standing close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. For a moment, I'd thought he was going to kiss me, and I'd realised that I wanted him to. The desire had been so sudden and intense that it had scared me, and I'd stepped back quickly, making an excuse about needing to get home to David. But the almost moment had stayed with me, replaying in my mind during quiet moments with my husband, making me hyper-aware of what was missing from our physical relationship. David and I had been struggling with intimacy for months, our sex life becoming as routine and predictable as every other aspect of our marriage. Where we'd once been spontaneous and playful, we'd settled into a pattern of perfunctory encounters that felt more like checking off a box than expressing desire. I'd started to wonder if this was just what happened to all marriages eventually, or if David and I had lost something essential that other couples managed to maintain. The contrast with my memories of Ted was stark and troubling. Our physical relationship had been intense and electric, full of the kind of passion that made everything else fade into the background. Even our fights had been passionate, filled with the kind of emotional intensity that, while exhausting, had made me feel completely alive. In the days leading up to my celebration dinner with David, I'd found myself thinking about Ted more frequently. When David had talked about wanting to spice up our marriage, my mind had immediately gone to my ex-boyfriend, and the way he'd always known how to surprise and excite me. The suggestion to invite Ted had felt like a joke at the moment, but I was beginning to realise that some part of me had meant it seriously. The morning after our disastrous dinner, David confronted me with a directness that was unusual for him. Instead of his typical gentle approach to conflict, he asked me point blank whether I'd been in contact with Ted beyond the initial coffee meeting I'd mentioned. The question caught me off guard, and my hesitation before answering told him everything he needed to know. When I admitted to the additional meetings, David's expression shifted from confused hurt to something much more serious. He wanted to know why I'd lied by omission, why I'd felt the need to keep our friendship secret if it was truly innocent. I tried to explain that I hadn't wanted to worry him unnecessarily, that the meetings had been casual and meaningless, but David wasn't accepting my explanations. He asked to see my phone, a request that felt like a violation, but one I couldn't refuse without seeming guilty. As David scrolled through my text messages with Ted, I watched his face grow more and more closed off. The messages weren't explicitly romantic, but they revealed a level of emotional intimacy and frequency of contact that went far beyond casual friendship. David read aloud some of Ted's messages about missing our connection and wondering what might have been, and some of my responses that were more encouraging than I'd remembered. Seeing our correspondence through David's eyes, I realized how the cumulative effect of our conversations would look to my husband, like an emotional affair that was building towards something more. The worst part was Ted's most recent message, sent just hours before my dinner with David, expressing how much he was looking forward to seeing me again, and how our reconnection had made him realize what he'd been missing. I'd responded with enthusiasm, telling him that I'd been thinking about him too, and that our conversations had been the highlight of my recent weeks. David set my phone down carefully and asked me directly whether I was still in love with Ted. The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that I didn't have a clear answer. I wasn't sure if what I felt for Ted was love or nostalgia, or simply the thrill of remembering who I'd been before I'd settled into the comfortable routine of married life. My inability to immediately deny still having feelings for Ted was answer enough for David. He told me that he needed some time to think about what this meant for our marriage, and that in the meantime, he expected me to cut off all contact with Ted completely. No more coffee meetings, no more text messages, no more social media interactions. The ultimatum felt controlling and unfair, especially since I'd never actually done anything physical with Ted. I argued that David was overreacting, that he was being jealous and possessive over a friendship that posed no real threat to our marriage. But David was unmoved by my protests, pointing out that I'd already demonstrated that I couldn't be trusted to maintain appropriate boundaries with my ex-boyfriend. Reluctantly, I agreed to David's conditions, more to end the immediate conflict than because I thought they were reasonable. I sent Ted a brief message, explaining that my husband was uncomfortable with our friendship and that I needed to focus on my marriage. Ted's response was understanding but disappointed, and he left the door open for future contact if my situation changed. David insisted that we start couples therapy immediately, and I went along with it to prove my commitment to saving our marriage. But sitting in Dr. Peterson's neutral office twice a week, I found myself growing more resentful rather than more connected to my husband. The therapist's questions about our communication patterns and emotional needs only highlighted how different David and I had become, how little we seemed to understand about what the other person wanted from life. During one particularly intense session, Dr. Peterson asked me directly what I thought I was missing in my marriage that had led me to seek emotional connection elsewhere. The question forced me to articulate feelings I'd been avoiding, and I found myself admitting that I felt trapped by the predictability of our life together, that I sometimes wondered if I'd married David for security rather than passion. David listened to my confession with a pain in his eyes that made me immediately want to take back my words, but the truth had been spoken and couldn't be undone. When Dr. Peterson asked him how he felt about my revelation, David said quietly that he'd always known he wasn't the most exciting person in the world, but he'd hoped that his love and commitment would be enough to make me happy. The therapy sessions became a weekly exercise in cataloguing our incompatibilities rather than finding ways to bridge them. I resented having to defend my need for excitement and spontaneity, while David felt attacked for being steady and reliable. Dr. Peterson tried to help us find middle ground, but it became increasingly clear that we wanted fundamentally different things from our relationship. The breakthrough moment came during our 8th session, when Dr. Peterson asked me whether I would choose to marry David again if I could go back and make the decision with everything I knew now. The question was meant to help me clarify my commitment to working on our marriage, but my long pause before answering revealed more than any words could have. In that silence, I realized that I probably wouldn't choose David again, that I'd been comparing him unfavorably to Ted for months, that I'd been staying in our marriage out of habit and obligation rather than genuine desire. The recognition of my own emotional detachment was shocking, but I couldn't deny the truth of it once it had surfaced. David saw the answer in my face before I could figure out how to put it into words. During the car ride home from that session, he told me that he finally understood what he was up against. Not just Ted, but my fundamental dissatisfaction with the kind of man he was and the kind of life he could offer me. That evening, David made an announcement that caught me completely off guard. He said he'd been thinking about our future together, and he'd reached the conclusion that I would never be fully happy with him. He said he deserved to be with someone who chose him enthusiastically rather than settling for him, and that I deserved the chance to find whatever it was I was really looking for. I tried to argue with his assessment, telling him that we could work through our problems if we both committed to the process. But David had clearly been thinking about this for longer than I'd realized. He pointed out that I'd been emotionally distant for months before Ted had even re-entered my life, that my willingness to reconnect with my ex-boyfriend was just a symptom of my deeper unhappiness with our marriage. The next morning, I came home from work to find divorce papers on our kitchen table. David had consulted with an attorney and filed for irreconcilable differences, citing our inability to reconcile our fundamental incompatibilities despite professional counselling. The legal language made our emotional crisis sound clinical and final, like a business arrangement that simply wasn't working out. My first reaction was shock and anger that David had made such a drastic decision without giving me a chance to fight for our marriage. I accused him of giving up too easily, of being unable to handle the normal challenges that all relationships faced. But David was calm and resolute in a way that I'd never seen before, explaining that he'd spent weeks thinking about whether we could find a way back to each other and had concluded that we couldn't. He told me that the comment about inviting Ted to join us had been the moment he'd finally understood that I was already emotionally gone from our marriage. The joke had revealed what I'd been thinking about, what I'd been missing, what I'd been wanting. David said he couldn't compete with a fantasy, and he didn't want to spend the rest of his life wondering whether I was truly committed to him or just staying because it was easier than starting over. The practical details of divorce were surprisingly straightforward, given how complicated our emotional situation felt. We'd been married only 4 years, had no children, and had kept our finances largely separate despite sharing a mortgage. David offered to buy out my share of the house, using money from his retirement account to give me a lump sum that would allow me to find my own place. The social aftermath of our divorce was more complicated than the legal process. Our friends were shocked by the sudden end of what had appeared to be a stable marriage, and I found myself having to explain repeatedly that we'd simply grown apart. Most people seemed to accept this explanation, but I could sense them trying to read between the lines, wondering what had really happened. My family's reaction was particularly difficult to navigate. My parents had adored David, seeing him as the responsible, caring husband they'd always hoped I would find. When I told them about the divorce, they immediately wanted to know what had gone wrong and whether there was any way to fix it. I couldn't bring myself to admit that I'd been emotionally involved with my ex-boyfriend, so I stuck to vague explanations about incompatibility and growing apart. The hardest part was watching David move on with his life while I struggled to figure out what I actually wanted. Within 3 months of our divorce being finalised, I learned through mutual friends that he'd started dating someone new, a woman named Jennifer, who worked at his firm and apparently appreciated his steady, reliable nature in a way that I never had. Seeing David with someone who seemed genuinely happy with the kind of man he was forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself. I'd spent our entire marriage trying to change him into someone more exciting, never appreciating the qualities that had drawn me to him in the first place. Jennifer seemed to love David exactly as he was, finding security and comfort in the predictability that I'd found suffocating. Meanwhile, my reconnection with Ted had not developed into the passionate romance I'd imagined during those coffee meetings. When I'd reached out to him after my separation from David, I'd discovered that he'd started seeing someone else, a colleague from his consulting firm who shared his love of travel and adventure. Ted had been kind, but clear that he wasn't looking for a serious relationship, especially not with someone who was dealing with the emotional fallout of a recent divorce. The rejection stung more than I had expected, forcing me to realize that I'd built up Ted in my mind as an alternative to David, without really considering whether he was interested in building a life with me. I'd destroyed my marriage for the fantasy of rekindling a college romance with someone who had always been commitment phobic and was apparently still avoiding serious relationships. Living alone in my one-bedroom apartment, I had plenty of time to reflect on the choices that had led me to this point. I'd traded a loving, stable marriage for the excitement of emotional affair that had led nowhere. I'd given up a partner who had been completely devoted to me in favor of pursuing someone who had already proven once that he wouldn't choose me when commitment was required. The irony wasn't lost on me that my search for excitement and passion had led to a much more boring and lonely life than the one I'd shared with David. My evenings were now spent watching Netflix alone instead of sharing quiet dinners with someone who cared about my day. My weekends were filled with errands and solitary activities instead of the couple's routines that I'd once found suffocating. Work became my primary focus as I tried to rebuild my life and prove to myself that I could be successful independently. I threw myself into my marketing projects with renewed energy, staying late to perfect campaigns and volunteering for high-profile assignments that might lead to future advancement. My colleagues noticed my increased dedication, and I received positive feedback that suggested my career trajectory was solid, even if my personal life was in shambles. But professional success couldn't fill the emotional void that had opened up in my life. I missed having someone to share daily experiences with, someone who cared about my small victories and frustrations. I missed being part of a team, working towards shared goals and building something together. Most of all, I missed feeling like I mattered to someone in a fundamental way. The realization that I'd thrown away something valuable in pursuit of something that had never really existed was a bitter pill to swallow. David had offered me genuine love, unwavering support, and a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. I'd rejected all of that because it hadn't felt exciting enough, because I'd been chasing a fantasy of passion that had ultimately proven hollow. Months after our divorce was finalized, I ran into David and Jennifer at a restaurant where he and I used to have dinner regularly. They looked comfortable together, relaxed in a way that David and I had been in our early days, before I'd started taking our relationship for granted. Seeing them together forced me to confront the full scope of what I'd lost, and what David had gained by ending our marriage. The conversation was polite but brief, filled with the careful pleasantries that ex-spouses exchange when they want to prove they've moved on successfully. But I could see the genuine happiness in David's eyes when he looked at Jennifer, the same expression he'd once reserved for me before I'd started pulling away from him emotionally. As I watched them leave the restaurant together, I understood that David had been right to file for divorce. He'd recognized that I was never going to be satisfied with the life we'd built together, and he'd been brave enough to end things before we'd wasted more years trying to force something that wasn't working. Jennifer clearly appreciated the stability and devotion that I'd found boring, and David deserved to be with someone who loved him for who he was rather than who they wanted him to become. The lesson I'd learned too late was that some jokes reveal truths we're not ready to face, and some truths destroy everything we should have valued. My casual suggestion about inviting Ted to join us had been a window into my real desires, showing David that I was already emotionally elsewhere. The divorce papers he'd filed hadn't been an overreaction to a harmless comment. They'd been a rational response to the recognition that our marriage was already over in every way that mattered. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. What city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever made a joke that revealed more than you intended? Sometimes our casual words can destroy everything we should have protected. Share your thoughts about where the line should be drawn between harmless fun and relationship-ending honesty, and I'll see you in the next story.